David pushed his mop across the shiny marble floor, the smell of cleaning liquid rising into the air. It was early morning, the kind of hour when the city was still half asleep, but the building's lights were already awake. He wore the same faded blue uniform he had worn for years, the fabric thin from too many washes, in his pocket. He carried a small cloth, a bottle of cleaner, and a folded note that reminded him of the rent he had to pay. The tall office building stood like a giant in the middle of the city, filled with men and women in sharp suits. They walked past David without looking at him, some even turning their faces away as if his presence made the air heavy. A few didn't even bother hiding their laughter when they saw him bent over a bucket, his hands wrinkled from the water. One young man in a gray suit dropped his empty coffee cup right in front of David's freshly cleaned floor. "Oops," the man said with a smirk, not even pretending it was an accident. David looked at him for a moment, his eyes calm, then bent down and picked it up, silently cleaning the spill. To the people in that building, David was invisible. Nothing more than the man who removed their mess. At lunchtime, the lobby filled with chatter. Two women near the reception desk whispered loudly enough for David to hear. "Can you imagine working here for years and still just being the cleaner?" One said, "Some people just don't aim high." The other replied, laughing. David didn't say a word. He never did. He simply continued polishing the glass doors until they sparkled like mirrors. But inside his mind, he repeated the same quiet thought: "One day, you will see me differently." When the elevator doors opened, a group of interns stepped out. One of them held a phone and pointed it toward David. "Hey, smile for the camera," the boy said. David turned his face away. Not wanting to be part of their little joke, the group laughed anyway, the sound bouncing off the marble walls. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. David's shift started before the sun rose and ended long after the sky turned black. He took the early morning cleaning so the building would be spotless before the bosses arrived. Then he worked again in the evening, mopping floors after everyone went home. Some days he skipped meals to save money. Other days he sat on the bench outside with a paper bag lunch, watching the busy people rush past him without a second glance. One rainy day, a cold wind blew through the building's entrance. A man with a loud voice shouted at David, "Hey, you missed a spot." David turned to see a coffee stain on the floor before he could reach it. The man walked away laughing. The janitor bent down and scrubbed the spot until it was gone. His knees ached, his back hurt, but he didn't stop. To him, doing the job right was more important than their laughter. Sometimes, while cleaning the lobby's big windows, David would pause and look at the city outside. Tall towers reached for the clouds. The streets below were filled with people chasing their dreams. David knew he had dreams too, though no one would believe it if he told them. People saw a cleaner and thought they knew his whole story. They didn't know about the books he read. At night, they didn't know about the small notebook in his pocket, filled with numbers and plans. They didn't know that every coin he saved had a purpose. The security guard, Mr. Lewis, was one of the few who spoke to him kindly. "You work too hard, David," he would say. David just smiled. Hard work never hurt anyone, but in his heart, he knew he wasn't working only for today. He was working for a future they couldn't see yet. That evening, as the office emptied, David stayed behind to finish mopping the last floor. The building was quiet now, the laughter gone. Only the sound of his mop gliding over the floor echoed in the wide hallway. He stopped for a moment, leaned on the handle, and looked at his reflection in the clean tiles. One day, he told himself again, "One day they will know who I really am." Outside, the rain had stopped. David stepped into the night with his bucket and mop. The streetlights painted golden circles. On the wet pavement, the world seemed calm, but inside David's chest burned a fire no one could see. He walked home slowly, not because he was tired, but because he was thinking. Thinking about all the times they laughed at him, thinking about all the hours he had given to this job, and thinking about how, when the time came, he would walk back into that building not as the cleaner they mocked, but as something far greater when David's long shift ended. Most people would expect him to collapse on his bed and sleep until the morning. But that wasn't David's life. Every evening, after taking a quick shower in his small rented room, he put on a clean shirt, picked up his worn-out backpack, and walked to the neighborhood library. The street was dim, the smell of rain still fresh in the air, but David's steps were steady. Inside the library, the warm yellow lights welcomed him. He greeted Mrs. Parker, the elderly librarian who had known him for years. "You're back again, David," she said with a gentle smile. David nodded. "Can't stay away from these books most nights." He sat at the same corner table with a stack of business books in front of him. He read about property investment, how to save money, and how to start small businesses. The words were not easy. Some of them he had to look up in a dictionary, but he never gave up. Mrs. Parker noticed his determination and often brought him a cup of tea. "You know, David," she said one night, "knowledge is a ladder. It might take time, but it can take you anywhere." David smiled, knowing she was one of the very few people who believed he could climb it. In his backpack, he always carried a small notebook with frayed edges. On its pages were his secret plans, how much money he needed to save, what kind of property he wanted to buy first, and how many months it might take. Every coin he saved from his cleaning job had a place in that plan. He didn't waste money on new clothes or expensive food. If his shoes wore thin, he patched them. If his jacket tore, he stitched it. He wasn't living for comfort. Now he was living for tomorrow. One night, after reading until the library was about to close, David stayed behind to talk to Mrs. Parker. "Do you think someone like me could really become a business owner?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Parker looked at him over her glasses. "David, it's not about someone like you, it's about someone willing to work like you." Her words stayed in his heart long after he walked out into the cool night air on weekends. While others rested, David visited open houses in the poorer parts of the city. He told the agents he was just looking, but secretly studied how much repairs cost. He'd ask questions about plumbing, roofing, and electricity as if he were curious. In truth, he was building knowledge brick by brick. One small house caught his attention, a broken-down place with peeling paint and shattered windows. It was so cheap, it almost seemed worthless to others. But to David, it looked like a first step. He couldn't afford it yet, but in his mind, he saw the possibility. Meanwhile, at the office building, nothing had changed. The workers still passed him without a glance. Some still mocked him, especially a young man named Jason, who loved to make jokes about David's career. One afternoon, Jason spilled coffee in the lobby again, smiling as David cleaned it. "You'll be doing this forever, old man," Jason said. David didn't respond, but that night, while studying at the library, he thought about Jason's words. They didn't make him angry, they fueled his determination. He wrote in his notebook, "Forever is a choice. I choose not to stay here forever." David's savings grew slowly but steadily. He opened a small savings account that no one knew about every payday. He deposited a part of his earnings there before paying rent or bills. It wasn't much, but over time, the amount began to look promising. Still, the road was long, and David knew patience was his greatest weapon. One rainy evening, as David left the library, he passed by a real estate office. In the window was a photo of the same broken-down house he had seen before. It was still for sale. David stood there for a long moment, imagining himself fixing the place, repainting the walls, making it shine again. He whispered to himself. One day soon, back in his small room, David opened his notebook and recalculated everything. He cut down even more expenses: no eating out, no buying unnecessary items. Some nights he went to bed hungry, but he didn't complain. He knew that every sacrifice now was a brick in the foundation of his future, in the building where he worked. No one noticed that the quiet cleaner had a fire in his eyes. No one saw him rushing from the mop to the books. From the bucket to the bank, to them, he was just David, the janitor. But in his mind, he was David, the future owner, and deep down, he carried a dream so strong that no amount of laughter or humiliation could wash it away every time he polished the shiny marble floors. He thought about walking on them one day as the man who owned them, every time he cleaned the giant glass. Doors, he imagined seeing his name on a gold plaque by the entrance, and every time someone mocked him, he silently thanked them for giving him another reason to prove them wrong. David's secret dream was growing stronger. It was no longer just a hope, it was a plan, and he knew that soon. The people who never looked at him twice would have no choice but to see him clearly. It was a gray, rainy morning when David arrived at the building. The air smelled of wet concrete, and the marble floor at the entrance was already slippery from the storm outside. David set down his bucket and mop, ready to begin his daily routine. The building was quieter than usual, but soon the rush would begin. He liked these early moments, the silence before the chaos, the hum of the elevator before people filled the lobby. But that morning would be different. The new building manager, Mr. Collins, was a man with a loud voice and no patience. He had only been there for a month, yet everyone already feared him. His sharp eyes scanned every corner as if hunting for mistakes. When he saw David near the front doors, he frowned. Why is the floor still wet? Collins barked, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. David turned, surprised. "It just started, sir." "Oh, don't talk back to me," Collins interrupted, his tone like a whip. "You're here to clean, so do it, and do it properly." A few workers passing by slowed their steps to watch. Some hid smiles behind their coffee cups. One even whispered, "Here we go." As if waiting for a show, Collins didn't stop. "You people think you can just stand around? On your knees, scrub it clean now, while everyone's here." The words cut deeper than the cold rain outside. David swallowed hard, bent down, and began scrubbing the marble. His knees pressed against the hard, wet floor, his hands moving in quick circles. Laughter echoed softly from one side of the lobby, a young man, Jason. Always Jason took out his phone and started recording. The moment felt endless. Water splashed on David's uniform as people walked around him. One woman stepped over his bucket without a word, her heels clicking loudly. Another man joked. "Missed a spot. Cleaner." David's back ached. His fingers burned from the cleaning chemicals. But he didn't stop, he told himself. Finish the job. Walk away. Don't give them what they want. But then Jason crouched down. His phone still recording, smile for the camera. "David," he said. David didn't look up, didn't speak. Jason laughed. "What? Too shy now? Don't worry, I'll post this online, let everyone see how hard you work." The surrounding voices joined in small chuckles, whispers, the sound of amusement at his expense. When David finally finished, his knees and uniform were soaked. He stood up slowly, picked up his bucket, and walked to the storage room without looking at anyone. The laughter followed him down the hall. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He had been laughed at before, mocked, treated as invisible, but this was different. This was public humiliation, and it lit a fire so strong inside him, he could feel it burning in his chest. In the quiet of the storage room, David sat on a small wooden stool. He stared at the mop in his hands, the same mop he had held for years. His reflection stared back at him in the metal bucket. Tired eyes and worn features, he whispered to himself. "This is the last year I do this." The words were not a wish, they were a decision. That evening, he didn't go straight home. He went to the library earlier than usual. Mrs. Parker looked up from her desk, noticing his wet clothes. "David? What happened?" "Just another day," he said softly, sitting down at his usual table. But inside, his mind was racing. He pulled out his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote in bold letters, "No more delays." From that night on, David worked with a new kind of energy every extra hour he could get. He took it, he asked for night shifts, weekend shifts, even small cleaning jobs in other buildings. The money came in slowly, but faster than before. He cut his expenses even more in OT at the library. No bus rides if he could walk. Every coin went into the account. Every coin was another step. Away from the mop and bucket, the humiliation became his fuel whenever he felt tired. He remembered the sound of their laughter. Whenever he wanted to rest, he remembered Jason's phone camera. And whenever doubt crept in, he heard his own voice saying, "Last year, weeks turned into months." The rainy day humiliation faded from the worker's memories, but not from David's. He carried it like a stone in his pocket, heavy but useful. It reminded him why he had to keep going. Late one night, walking home from the library, David passed the building again. The lights inside glowed warmly, the marble floor in the lobby shining just like he had left it earlier. He stopped and looked at it from the outside. One day, he thought, I will walk in there, and they will stand, not laugh, and that day will be worth every drop of water, every aching knee, and every long night, the months after that rainy morning. Passed slowly, but for David, every single day was a step forward. He no longer counted his shifts and hours. He counted them in savings. Every dollar he earned had a purpose. Every coin was part of the plan that lived in his notebook, but progress was not easy. The road to change never is. On weekdays, David cleaned the tall office building as usual on weekends. He took extra jobs washing windows for small shops, sweeping warehouse floors, even scrubbing kitchens in restaurants after closing time. He often worked until his hands were cracked and raw from chemicals. When his feet ached, he told himself, "This pain will buy my future." Finally, after almost a year of saving, David had enough to make an offer on the small, broken-down house he had been watching. It wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, a sagging roof, weeds growing taller than the windows, but David saw more than what was there. He saw what it could become. He made the deal and signed the papers, his hands shaking as he wrote his name. It was the first thing he had ever owned. He stood in front of the house that night, the street quiet, the air cool, and whispered, "This is only the beginning." But beginnings are rarely smooth. The repairs cost more than he had planned. A man he trusted to help with roofing ran away with half of the repair money. For 2 days, David barely ate, the betrayal heavy in his chest. But instead of giving up, he picked up a hammer himself. He patched what he could, learned from videos at the library, and slowly made the place livable. It wasn't perfect, but it could be rented. And that meant income. The first tenant moved in 2 months later. It wasn't a big rent, but it was steady. David took that income and added it to his savings. He didn't celebrate yet. He was still far from his dream. Instead, he quietly began looking for the next opportunity. At the office building, no one noticed the change in him. He still wore the same uniform, pushed the same mop. But now he carried a secret confidence whenever he cleaned the glass doors. He imagined his reflection as a man in a suit whenever Jason made a comment. David simply smiled, knowing that one day the roles would reverse. Months later, he bought a second property, this one slightly better, but still needing work. He repeated the same process: fix, rent, save. It became a rhythm: hard work during the day, planning, and learning at night. He was climbing a ladder no one else could see. Step by step, dollar by dollar, but the climb was exhausting. There were nights he came home and collapsed into bed without eating. Days when his back pain was so bad he had to stop mid-shift to rest. He thought about slowing down, But then the memory of kneeling on the wet lobby floor returned. That memory became his fuel. The humiliation that had once burned like shame now burned like fire, pushing him upward. 2 years after buying his first house, David owned 4 small properties. None of them were fancy, but each one earned him enough to grow his savings faster. Mrs. Parker noticed the difference. "You've been busy," she said one evening at the library. "Your eyes look different, like someone who knows where he's going." David smiled. "I'm getting closer." One winter morning, while walking past the real estate listings, David froze. In the center of the display was a photo of a building he knew all too well, the tall office building he had cleaned for years. It was for sale. The price was high, far higher than anything he had ever thought about. But something inside him said, "This is the one." He spent nights running numbers, making calls, and meeting with bankers. Most told him it was impossible. But David had been told impossible his whole life. He wasn't afraid of the word anymore. He was willing to fight for this, even if it took everything he had. When he finally submitted his offer, his hands trembled just like the day he bought his first house. He didn't tell anyone, not Mrs. Parker, not even the tenants in his properties. This was between him and the dream he had carried for years. 4 weeks he waited, working his usual shifts as if nothing had changed. No one in the building knew the cleaner was trying to buy the very floors he mopped. No one knew that every time he polished the marble, imagined it shining under his ownership. One rainy afternoon, just like the day of his humiliation, David received the call. His offer had been accepted. He stood there in the storage room, holding the phone, staring at the mop leaning against the wall. The long climb was not over, but the top was finally in sight. The day David signed the final papers, the air felt different. It wasn't the cool breeze outside or the faint smell of rain. It was the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. He sat in the lawyer's office, pen in hand, staring at the documents in front of him. At the top of the page was the name of the building he had mopped for nearly 2 decades. This time, his name would be next to the word owner. His fingers trembled slightly as he signed, not from fear, but from the quiet disbelief that this moment was real. When the lawyer shook his hand, David simply nodded. No big smile, no loud celebration, just a deep breath as if sealing the memory inside. On his way out, he walked past the tall glass windows of the office and saw his reflection for the first time in his life. He didn't see the man in the blue cleaner's uniform. He saw a man who had climbed a mountain brick by brick. He could have walked into the building that very day and announced the news. He could have demanded respect from the same people who once mocked him. But that wasn't David's way. He wanted to return quietly, to watch and listen before the truth was revealed. There was power in patience, and David had mastered patience. Long ago, the next morning, he put on his usual uniform and entered the building as if nothing had changed. The smell of fresh coffee and perfume filled the air. Workers rushed past him, phones in hand, voices busy with meetings and deadlines. Jason was by the reception desk, laughing at something on his phone. He glanced at David and smirked. "Still here, old man?" David only smiled. Still here, as the day went on. David visited parts of the building he usually never had reason to go to. He inspected the offices, the storage rooms, even the rooftop garden. Some employees gave him strange looks. Why was the cleaner walking around so much? He simply told them he was checking for any repairs that needed attention. In truth, he was seeing his building through new eyes, not as a worker, but as the one responsible for it all. That evening, after most people had left, David stood alone. In the lobby, the marble floor reflected the golden light from the chandeliers. He remembered scrubbing this very spot on his knees while people laughed. Now he stood tall, hands in his pockets. Knowing that every tile beneath his feet belonged to him, it was a quiet victory, but it was his. Over the next week, David began making small changes. The cleaning supplies room got upgraded equipment. The security staff received new chairs and better uniforms. The building's heating system, which had been faulty for years, was fixed. People noticed the improvements but had no idea who was behind them. Rumors began to spread. The new owner must be someone who cares about the workers. One woman said. David smiled when he overheard it. Knowing the truth was still hidden. Friday afternoon, he walked into the management office where Mr. Collins, the building manager, was arguing with a tenant. Collins looked up, frowning at David. "What do you want?" "This isn't your place." David handed him an envelope. "This might change that." Inside was a formal letter from the property firm, naming David as the building's new owner. Collins read it twice, his face draining of color. David stayed, silent, letting the truth sink in. But he didn't make a scene. He simply said, "We'll talk Monday," and walked out. Leaving Collins staring after him, he still hadn't told the rest of the staff. He wanted the reveal to be something they would never forget. That weekend, David planned the announcement. It wouldn't be about revenge, would be about respect. He remembered every insult, every time someone made him feel invisible. But he also remembered the few who had treated him kindly. This wasn't just about proving himself. It was about showing everyone that dignity could outlast cruelty. On Monday morning, he arrived at the building in a crisp black suit instead of his uniform. The lobby was full of people starting their day. The click of his polished shoes on the marble made some heads turn. Jason, standing near the elevators, actually frowned in confusion. "Whoa, David? What's with the get-up?" he asked. David smiled. "You'll see." The staff meeting had been called for 9 a.m. by the time everyone was gathered in the lobby. Whispers had spread about the cleaner in the suit. David stepped forward, his voice steady. "I worked here for many years," he began. Some chuckled quietly. Thinking it was a joke, he continued, "I cleaned these floors, emptied your trash, and scrubbed your walls. While many of you didn't even know my name, the room grew quieter. But today, you will know it because, as of last week, I am the new owner of this building." Gasps filled the air. Jason's smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief. "Mr.?" Collins shifted uncomfortably at the back. David let the silence settle before adding, "I didn't come here to fire anyone. But I came to remind you every person you meet deserves respect, no matter what job they have." And with that, he walked past them, heading toward the office that was now his. Every step echoed with the weight of the journey he had taken. It had been long, it had been hard, but he had climbed it in silence, and now he stood at the top. The lobby was frozen in silence after David's words. Some people stared at him with wide eyes, others exchanged quick glances as if to confirm they'd heard him correctly. Jason's face was a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. Mr. Collins stood stiff at the back, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the papers in his hand. David didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. His calm tone seemed to carry more weight than anger ever could. "I know many of you are surprised," he said, slowly scanning the crowd. "I know some of you remember the jokes, the whispers, and the times you walked past me as if I wasn't here. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but I also remember the few who treated me with kindness," he continued, his eyes resting briefly on the security guard. "Mr. Lewis and the receptionist, Claire, this building is mine now. But it belongs to all of us who work here. It will be a place where respect is the rule, not the exception." The tension in the room was thick. Jason stepped forward, his usual smirk gone. "David. I mean, Mr. David." You don't need to say anything now," David interrupted gently. Jason lowered his head, his cheeks turning red. David's gaze moved to Mr. Collins. "We'll be discussing your position later today," he said firmly. Collins nodded stiffly, understanding exactly what that meant after the meeting. Whispers filled the air like a low hum. Some workers approached David to congratulate him. Others avoided his eyes, too ashamed of their past behavior. David didn't let the attention slow him. He went straight to the office that used to belong. To the old owner, the desk was large, the chair high-backed, and the view from the window stretched across the city skyline. He stood there for a moment, remembering the times he'd looked up at this building from the street. Now, he was looking out from the top floor. Throughout the day, people came in to speak with him. Some offered polite smiles, others made awkward attempts to explain away their past cruelty. David listened but didn't dwell on old wounds. Instead, he focused on what came next. The first change was immediate. He ordered salary increases for the cleaning staff and better break facilities for everyone. When the news spread, the same people who once ignored him began to see him in a new light. That afternoon, Jason knocked on the door. David looked up from his papers. "Come in." Jason stepped inside, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitation. I wanted to apologize," Jason said quietly. David studied him for a moment. "You don't have to apologize to me," he replied. Jason frowned, confused. "You have to apologize to yourself," David added. "Because you let who I was blind? You too, who I could be?" Jason nodded slowly, realizing the truth in the words, later. Mr. Lewis stopped by with a broad smile. "Never thought I'd see the day," the guard said warmly, shaking David's hand. "You were one of the few who treated me like a person," David said sincerely. "I won't forget that." The old man grinned. "Guess I'll have to get used to calling you boss now." David chuckled. "David will do just fine." By evening, the building felt different. The same marble floors, the same glass doors. But there was a new energy one built on. The shock of the morning's revelation as David walked through the halls. People stepped aside respectfully. No one threw careless comments. No one pretended not to see him for the first time. He felt the weight of ownership, not as power, but as responsibility. Before leaving for the night, David returned to the lobby. The lights reflected on the polished floor, the same floor where he had once been ordered to scrub on his knees. He stood there for a long moment. Memories flooded back, the smell of the cleaning chemicals, the sound of laughter, the burn of humiliation. But now, those memories didn't hurt. They reminded him of how far he had come. He looked at the security camera in the corner and smiled to himself. Not long ago, Jason had filmed him to mock him. Today, the cameras recorded something else: his victory. He took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. This was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter. When he stepped outside, the cool night air felt fresher than ever. The city lights glittered, and for the first time in years, David didn't feel small walking among them. He felt exactly where he was meant to be. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, the truth had been spoken, and it had changed everything. The next morning, the building was quieter than usual. People still greeted David differently now, some with smiles, others with nervous nods. But there was no more laughter at his expense, no more careless words thrown his way. The air felt heavier, as if everyone was still processing what had happened the day before. David arrived early, not to clean, but to walk through the building as its owner. Yet he still stopped to check the work of the cleaning staff. He spoke with them the same way he always had. "You're doing a great job," he told Maria, a young cleaner who had started just a month ago. Her eyes lit up. She wasn't used to hearing such words from management. "I wish someone told me that when I started," David said quietly, almost to himself. By mid-morning, he called for a second staff meeting. This time, it wasn't to shock them, it was to set a new tone as everyone gathered in the lobby. The memory of yesterday's announcement still hung in the air. David stood at the front, hands resting calmly in his pockets. "I want to thank you all for your work," he began, "and I want to tell you something important." He paused, scanning the crowd, making sure every face was looking at him. "When I was the cleaner here, I learned something," he said. "I learned that the way you treat people says more about you than it does about them." Some employees lowered their eyes. "I cleaned your floors, your offices, your bathrooms, and most of you never learned my name." His voice was steady, not bitter, but filled with truth. "But a few of you looked at me and saw a person, not just a job, and those are the people I respect the most." He turned toward Mr. Lewis, the security guard. "Respect costs nothing," David said, "but it can change everything." Mr. Lewis smiled and nodded. David continued, "I didn't buy this building to get revenge. And I'm not here to fire people for the past." A few people looked relieved. "I bought it to make sure that no one who works here feels invisible again." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then David laid out his plans: better wages for the cleaning crew, training programs for young employees who wanted to grow, suggestion box that would actually be read, because the truth is, he said, everyone in this building keeps it running, not just the people with the biggest offices. Jason raised his hand, surprising everyone. "I know I can't change what I did," Jason said slowly, "but I want to help with this if you'll let me." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Change starts when you decide to walk a different path," David replied. Jason lowered his hand, looking more serious than anyone had ever seen him. When the meeting ended, people didn't rush off the way they usually did. Small groups stayed behind, talking quietly. Some even approached the cleaners to thank them for their work. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, David walked through the lobby again. The marble floor shone just as it always had. But now, when people passed him, they looked him in the eye. Some smiled, some nodded respectfully. It was a small thing, but to David, it meant everything. By evening, as the last workers left, David stood alone in the empty lobby. The golden light from the chandeliers reflected on the polished tiles. He walked slowly across the floor, remembering the day he had been forced to scrub it on his knees while people laughed. He stopped in the exact spot where that humiliation had happened. But now, he stood tall, his head high. He whispered to himself, "I kept my promise." It was the same promise he had made years ago in silence, the promise that one day they would see him differently. And now they did, when he stepped outside. The cool evening air wrapped around him. The city lights sparkled in the distance. He looked back at the building, his building, and smiled. Not because he owned it, but because he had changed it. From a place of arrogance to a place of respect. David knew the journey hadn't just been about buying a building. It had been about proving that dignity could survive hardship, that quiet determination could outlast cruelty, and that respect was worth more than any title. As he walked away into the night, he didn't need applause. He didn't need everyone to love him. What mattered was that the people inside those walls would think twice before judging someone by their job again. That was his final lesson, and it was one they would carry long after he was gone.